He was locked in a Japanese prison camp with nothing but scraps. No tools. No parts. No hope. But this one prisoner built a working radio from garbage and rusty nails that would expose the biggest war crime cover-up in the Pacific. Cabanatuan Prison Camp, Philippines. Over 500 American and Allied prisoners are dying from starvation, disease, and Japanese brutality. The guards say the war is going well for Japan. That rescue is impossible. That surrender is the only option. But one prisoner, a radio operator named Colonel James Devereux, refuses to believe it. He's going to build a radio receiver from nothing. And what he hears on that radio will change everything. This is the story of the most important piece of garbage ever assembled and the men who risked execution to build it. James Devereux wasn't supposed to be in a prison camp. He was supposed to be dead. Born in 1903, Devereux joined the Marines in 1923. He became an officer and spent years in various postings around the world. When World War II started, he was assigned to command the Marine garrison on Wake Island, a tiny coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Wake Island was strategically located between Hawaii and the Philippines. The U.S. had built a small naval base and airfield there. On December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked Wake Island. Devereux's Marines fought back with everything they had. They had a handful of fighters, some coastal defense guns, and about 450 Marines and civilian contractors. Against them, Japan sent thousands of troops, multiple warships, and overwhelming air support. The Marines held out for 16 days. They shot down dozens of Japanese aircraft. They sank 2 Japanese destroyers with their coastal guns. They repelled the first Japanese landing attempt, one of the only times in the war that amphibious assault was defeated. But eventually, they were overwhelmed. On December 23, 1941, Devereux surrendered Wake Island to prevent the massacre of the remaining defenders. The Japanese were furious about their losses at Wake. They'd expected an easy victory. Instead, they'd lost ships and hundreds of men to a tiny garrison. So they took revenge on the prisoners. Devereux and his men were beaten, starved, and transported to various prison camps. About 100 of the Wake Island prisoners were kept on the island and later executed by the Japanese in 1943. Devereux didn't learn about this atrocity until after the war, but he suspected his men were being killed. By 1944, Devereux was in Cabanatuan prison camp in the Philippines. This was one of the worst Japanese prison camps. Thousands of American and Filipino prisoners had died there from disease, malnutrition, and Japanese brutality. The camp was overcrowded. Food was minimal. Medical care was non-existent. Men died every day from preventable diseases like dysentery, malaria, and beriberi. But the physical suffering wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the isolation. The prisoners had no idea what was happening in the war. The Japanese guards told them that Japan was winning. That America had sued for peace. That the prisoners would spend the rest of their lives in camps. That resistance was pointless. That hope was foolish. Most prisoners didn't believe the guards completely, but they had no way to know the truth. Years had passed since they'd been captured. For all they knew, Japan really was winning. Maybe America had decided the Pacific wasn't worth fighting for. Maybe they'd been abandoned. The uncertainty was crushing. It destroyed morale worse than hunger or disease. Some prisoners gave up. They stopped caring whether they lived or died. They stopped fighting disease. They stopped trying to maintain discipline and hope. Without information, without any connection to the outside world, men simply lost the will to survive. Devereux watched his men dying, not just from physical causes but from despair. And he decided he had to do something. He had to find out what was really happening in the war. He had to get information that would give the men hope. He needed to build a radio. This was an insane idea. The Japanese forbade radios. Possession of a radio meant execution. Not just for the person who built it, but for everyone involved. The Japanese took radio prohibition seriously because they knew that information was power. If prisoners learned that Japan was losing, it would embolden them. It would create resistance and escape attempts. So radios were hunted ruthlessly. Japanese guards conducted regular searches. Informers among the prisoners reported suspicious activities. Building a radio in these conditions seemed impossible. But Devereux had one advantage. Before the war, he'd been trained in radio operations. He understood the basic principles. A radio receiver isn't terribly complex in theory. You need a circuit that can detect radio waves, an antenna to capture the signal, a way to filter and amplify the signal, and something to convert it into sound. In principle, you could build a simple radio from very basic components. The problem was getting those components. Devereux had nothing. No wire. No vacuum tubes. No resistors or capacitors. No batteries. No tools. Just the clothes on his back and whatever garbage he could scavenge in the camp. He'd have to build a radio from literal trash while hiding it from guards who would kill him if they found it. Devereux started planning. He couldn't tell anyone what he was doing. The fewer people who knew, the safer everyone was. He started collecting items. Tiny things that wouldn't be missed. A rusty nail here. A piece of wire there. A broken piece of metal. A scrap of fabric. Anything that might be useful. He hid his collection in various places around the camp. Under floorboards. In the latrine. Buried in the dirt. Never all in one place. For the antenna, Devereux needed wire. He found some rusty barbed wire from the camp fence that had been discarded. He carefully straightened it and hid it. For the detector, he needed something that could act as a diode, a component that lets electrical current flow in only one direction. Commercial radios used vacuum tubes or crystals. Devereux had neither. But he'd read about early radios that used a cat's whisker detector. A fine wire touching a piece of mineral could sometimes act as a diode. Devereux didn't have crystals, but he found that a rusty nail and a piece of pencil lead could sometimes work. The oxide layer on the rusty nail created a semiconductor junction when touched by the carbon in the pencil lead. It wasn't efficient, but it might work. For the coil needed to tune the circuit, he unwound wire from a broken motor he found in a garbage pile. He carefully wound the wire around a piece of bamboo to create an inductor. For a capacitor, Devereux used metal foil that he'd saved from some Japanese food packaging. He layered the foil with paper to create a crude variable capacitor. By adjusting how much the foil sheets overlapped, he could tune the circuit to different frequencies. For headphones, he had nothing. But he realized he didn't need traditional headphones. The signal would be very weak, but he could detect it by touching two wires to his tongue. The human tongue is sensitive to tiny electrical currents. If the radio was receiving a signal, he'd feel it. The construction process took months. Devereux could only work when he was sure he wouldn't be observed. Late at night. When guards were distracted. During confusion in the camp. He'd assemble pieces, test them, hide them again. It was painfully slow. And he had no way to know if it would work until the entire thing was assembled. By late 1944, Devereux had collected and assembled enough components to attempt his first test. He'd built what radio engineers would call a crystal set or crystal radio. These were the simplest type of radio receiver. They required no external power source. They worked by capturing the energy in radio waves themselves and converting it directly into sound. The efficiency was terrible, but they could work. Devereux waited for a night when the Japanese guards seemed less alert. He assembled his radio in a corner of the barracks. The antenna wire was strung along the ceiling, hidden among the rafters. The circuit was assembled on a small piece of wood. The detector was the rusty nail touching the pencil lead. He adjusted the contact point carefully. Too light and there'd be no connection. Too heavy and the resistance would be too high. He connected the antenna to the circuit. He adjusted his crude tuning capacitor. He touched the output wires to his tongue. And he felt nothing. No signal. No tingle. Nothing. Either the radio didn't work, or he was tuned to the wrong frequency, or there was no strong broadcast in range. Devereux adjusted the tuning. Still nothing. He tried different positions for the cat's whisker detector. Nothing. He worked for over an hour, making tiny adjustments, hoping for any sign of a signal. Finally, he felt something. A tiny tingle on his tongue. Rhythmic. Could it be a radio signal? He concentrated, trying to interpret the sensation. It was weak. Very weak. But it was definitely there. Some kind of modulation. But he couldn't make sense of it. The signal was too faint and the tongue wasn't a good detector. He needed better headphones. But how? Over the next weeks, Devereux tried to improve his radio. He experimented with different detector positions. He tried to increase the number of turns in his tuning coil. He searched for any material that might improve the capacitor or create better headphones. It was frustrating. He had a working radio in principle, but it wasn't good enough to actually receive intelligible broadcasts. Then Devereux had an idea. He couldn't build traditional headphones. But what if he built a simple speaker? Not a good speaker. Just something that would create sound from the electrical signal. He'd read about early radio experiments that used a metal diaphragm and an electromagnet. The varying electrical current in the electromagnet would cause the diaphragm to vibrate, creating sound. Devereux found a tin can in the garbage. He cut out the bottom to create a thin metal diaphragm. He built a simple electromagnet using wire wound around a nail. He positioned the electromagnet near the diaphragm. When electrical current passed through the electromagnet, it would pull on the metal diaphragm, causing it to vibrate and make sound. It was crude beyond belief. But it was something. He tested the contraption with his radio circuit. Adjusted the tuning. And suddenly, from the tin can speaker, came a faint crackling sound. Then something that might have been voices. Very faint. Barely audible. But definitely human voices. Devereux pressed his ear to the tin can. The voices became slightly clearer. American accents. Talking about something. He couldn't make out the words clearly. The signal faded in and out. But it was definitely an American broadcast. He was receiving a signal from somewhere. Maybe from Allied forces. Maybe from a clandestine radio. He didn't know. But he was hearing the outside world for the first time in years. Over the next several nights, Devereux refined his technique. He learned that early morning, around 4 or 5 a.m., was the best time to receive signals. Radio wave propagation is better in the early morning. He found a frequency that had regular broadcasts. He couldn't understand most of what was said because the signal was too weak and distorted. But he caught fragments. Enough to start piecing together information. What he heard changed everything. The broadcasts mentioned Allied advances. Names of islands being captured. References to the Philippines being liberated. This wasn't propaganda. These were American military broadcasts or news from Allied-controlled areas. And they were talking about victories. About Japan being pushed back. About liberation coming. Devereux realized he'd tapped into something crucial. The truth. The Japanese guards had been lying. Japan wasn't winning. They were losing. Badly. And the Philippines might be liberated soon. This information was pure gold. But it was also incredibly dangerous. If the Japanese found out, everyone involved would be killed. Devereux had to decide. Should he keep this information to himself? Should he tell the other prisoners? If he told them, morale would improve. Men who'd given up hope would start fighting to survive. But telling meant more people would know about the radio. More chances for the secret to leak. More risk of execution. Devereux decided to share the information, but carefully. He wouldn't tell anyone about the radio. He'd just pass along information as rumors. Things he'd overheard or heard from other prisoners. He'd be vague about sources. Make it seem like the information came through multiple channels so nobody could trace it back to the radio. He started spreading the news. The Americans were advancing in the Pacific. Islands were being captured. The Philippines would be liberated soon. Help was coming. Hold on. Survive. Liberation was possible. At first, many prisoners were skeptical. They'd heard false rumors before. Hopes had been raised and crushed too many times. But Devereux was persistent. He provided specific details. Names of islands. Dates. Information that seemed too detailed to be made up. Slowly, prisoners started believing. The change in morale was dramatic. Men who'd been lying in their bunks waiting to die suddenly had a reason to fight. They started taking care of themselves again. Helping each other. Resisting disease. The death rate in the camp began to drop, not because conditions improved, but because men had hope again. The Japanese guards noticed the change. They became suspicious. Why were the prisoners suddenly more energetic? More resistant? More defiant? The guards started interrogating prisoners. Where was this information coming from? Who was spreading rumors? The searches intensified. The guards were looking for something. A radio. A hidden message system. Something. Devereux knew he was being watched. He stopped using the radio for several weeks. Too dangerous. But the situation in the camp was deteriorating. The Japanese were becoming more brutal as they realized they were losing the war. Random beatings increased. Food rations were cut further. The guards were taking out their frustration on the prisoners. Devereux decided he had to risk using the radio again. The prisoners needed updated information. They needed to know how close liberation was. He waited for a night when the camp seemed quieter than usual. He assembled his radio. Tuned in. And what he heard shocked him. The broadcast Devereux picked up that night was from an American military station. And it mentioned Cabanatuan specifically. American forces had liberated other camps in the Philippines. They knew about Cabanatuan. And they were planning a rescue operation. The broadcast didn't give details about timing, but it was clear. Rescue was coming. Soon. Devereux disassembled the radio immediately and hid the components. This information was too important to keep secret. But he also couldn't cause a panic or tip off the guards. He had to spread the word carefully. He told a few trusted officers. Told them to prepare the men mentally for a possible rescue attempt. Told them to be ready to help if American forces arrived. But don't do anything obvious that would alert the Japanese. Over the next week, tension in the camp was unbearable. The prisoners knew something was coming but didn't know when or how. The Japanese guards sensed something was wrong. They increased security. Posted more guards. Conducted more searches. The camp was on edge. On the night of January 30, 1945, everything exploded. American Rangers and Filipino guerrillas attacked Cabanatuan prison camp. It was a perfectly executed raid. They'd infiltrated through the jungle. Taken out the guards silently. Then opened fire on the remaining Japanese forces. The battle lasted about 30 minutes. The Japanese garrison was overwhelmed. The Rangers burst into the prison compound shouting for American prisoners. The prisoners were in shock. After years of captivity, suddenly there were American soldiers. Real American soldiers with modern weapons. It seemed like a dream. But it was real. The Rangers hustled prisoners out of the camp. Over 500 prisoners were evacuated. Carried on makeshift stretchers if they couldn't walk. The entire rescue column moved through the jungle back to American lines. Devereux was among the rescued prisoners. As he left the camp, he thought about his radio. It was still hidden in pieces around the barracks. He considered going back to get it, but there wasn't time. The radio that had kept hope alive for months would be left behind. It didn't matter. It had served its purpose. The rescued prisoners were taken to field hospitals. Given medical treatment. Fed real food. Allowed to sleep without fear. Devereux was interviewed by intelligence officers. They wanted to know about conditions in the camp. About Japanese treatment of prisoners. About war crimes that had been committed. Devereux told them everything. Including about the radio he'd built. The intelligence officers were amazed. They wanted to know how he'd done it. What materials he'd used. How he'd kept it hidden. Devereux described the entire process. The scavenged parts. The crude construction. The risks involved. The information he'd gathered. The intelligence officers realized something important. Devereux's radio intercepts included information about other prison camps. About conditions. About atrocities. About planned executions of prisoners. Some of this information was crucial for planning other rescue operations. Other camps might be rescued before prisoners were executed. More importantly, Devereux's intercepts provided evidence of Japanese war crimes. After the war, this evidence would be used in war crimes tribunals. Japanese officers who'd ordered the abuse and execution of prisoners would face justice partly because of information that Devereux had gathered with his trash radio. But Devereux also learned something troubling. The 100 Wake Island prisoners who'd been kept on the island had been executed by the Japanese in 1943. They'd been machine-gunned and buried in a mass grave. Devereux had commanded those men. He'd surrendered to save their lives. And the Japanese had killed them anyway. This knowledge haunted Devereux for the rest of his life. After his rescue, Devereux was sent back to the United States for medical treatment and recovery. He was severely malnourished and suffering from various diseases contracted in the prison camp. But he survived. He recovered. And he returned to military service. He remained in the Marines after the war, eventually retiring as a brigadier general in 1948. Devereux was awarded numerous decorations for his defense of Wake Island and his leadership in captivity. But he always said the real heroes were the men who died. The Marines who fought at Wake Island. The prisoners who died in the camps. The Rangers who risked their lives to rescue prisoners. He was just a survivor. The story of James Devereux's prison camp radio is remarkable not because of the technology, which was crude, but because of what it represented. It represented hope. Resistance. The refusal to give up even in the most desperate circumstances. Devereux could have accepted his fate. Could have told himself that survival was enough. Instead, he took enormous risks to give his fellow prisoners something invaluable. Information. Truth. Hope. The radio itself was a technical marvel considering the circumstances. Building any kind of functional radio from garbage and rusty nails is an impressive achievement. Building one while being watched by guards who would execute you if they caught you is extraordinary. Devereux had to be engineer, spy, and psychologist all at once. He had to understand radio theory well enough to improvise a design. He had to be careful enough to avoid detection. And he had to know how to use the information he gathered to maximum effect. The impact of Devereux's radio went far beyond just morale. The information he gathered helped save lives. Other prisoners who might have given up instead held on because they knew rescue was possible. Intelligence about Japanese war crimes helped ensure that perpetrators faced justice after the war. Information about other camps helped plan rescue operations. The Cabanatuan Raid itself was one of the most successful rescue operations of World War II. Over 500 prisoners rescued with minimal casualties among the rescuers and prisoners. The operation was planned based partly on intelligence from multiple sources, including information from prisoners like Devereux who'd maintained contact with the outside world through clandestine means. Devereux's radio also demonstrates an important principle about technology and innovation. Complex problems don't always require complex solutions. A crude radio built from trash accomplished what a sophisticated radio would have accomplished. Perfection wasn't necessary. Good enough was good enough. This principle applies in many situations. Sometimes the best solution is the one you can implement with available resources, not the theoretical best solution that requires resources you don't have. The story also highlights the importance of specialized knowledge. Devereux could build the radio because he understood radio theory. His training and experience gave him knowledge that was crucial in an unexpected situation. This is an argument for broad education and diverse skills. You never know when specialized knowledge will become critical. Devereux's radio training probably seemed like just another part of his military education. But it became the difference between hope and despair for hundreds of prisoners. The risks Devereux took were enormous. If caught, he would have been tortured and executed. Other prisoners might have been killed as collective punishment. The entire camp could have suffered because of his actions. Devereux accepted these risks because he believed the potential benefit outweighed the danger. This kind of risk assessment in extreme circumstances requires both courage and judgment. Taking foolish risks gets people killed. But avoiding all risks in desperate situations means accepting defeat. After the war, Devereux rarely talked about his radio. He didn't see it as particularly heroic. To him, it was just something that needed to be done, so he did it. This attitude was common among World War II veterans. They'd done extraordinary things but saw them as ordinary. Just part of the job. Just what anyone would have done in the same situation. But not anyone would have done what Devereux did. Most people in his situation would have focused solely on personal survival. Would have kept their heads down. Avoided risks. Devereux chose differently. He chose to take risks to help others. To fight back against despair and isolation. To resist in whatever way he could. The prisoners who survived Cabanatuan and other camps had mixed feelings about their rescue. They were grateful to be free. But they felt guilty about the men who hadn't survived. Who'd died months or weeks before liberation. Who'd given up hope just before hope became reality. Devereux felt this survivor's guilt intensely. He knew that his radio had helped some men hold on. But it hadn't saved everyone. Men had died while he was building his radio. While he was gathering information. While he was spreading hope that came too late for them. This is the burden that people in leadership positions carry. You can't save everyone. You do what you can with what you have. You make the best decisions possible with incomplete information. And you live with the results, both good and bad. Devereux made decisions that saved lives. But he couldn't save all the lives. He had to live with that. The technical details of Devereux's radio have been lost to history. He never wrote down exactly how he constructed it. He described the general principles but not the specific details. This is unfortunate from a historical perspective. It would be interesting to know exactly how he solved various technical challenges. But from Devereux's perspective, the details didn't matter. The radio had served its purpose. It didn't need to be remembered. What does need to be remembered is what the radio represented. That humans are incredibly resourceful when necessary. That knowledge is power, literally in this case. That hope can be manufactured from information and spread even in the most controlled environments. That resistance is possible even when armed resistance isn't. That one person with specialized knowledge and determination can impact hundreds of lives. The prison camp radios built by various Allied prisoners during World War II were part of a larger pattern of resistance. Prisoners couldn't fight their captors with weapons. But they could resist in other ways. Through sabotage. Through passive resistance. Through maintaining military discipline and organization. Through gathering intelligence. Through escape attempts. And through maintaining hope and morale. These forms of resistance didn't change the strategic situation. Prison camp radios didn't win the war. But they helped prisoners survive until the war was won by others. And survival was its own form of victory. Every prisoner who survived to liberation was a defeat for the brutal camp system. Every prisoner who maintained their humanity despite years of degradation was proof that the human spirit couldn't be completely broken. Devereux's radio was a small thing. A crude device built from garbage. It wouldn't win any engineering awards. It barely functioned. But it was enough. It accomplished its mission. It kept hope alive. It spread truth in a place built on lies. It connected prisoners to the outside world when they were told they were forgotten. That's the real lesson of Devereux's radio. That small things can have big impacts. That simple solutions can solve complex problems. That one person's skills and determination can cascade through a community. That resistance is always possible if you're creative and brave enough to try. James Devereux died in 1988 at the age of 85. His obituaries focused on his defense of Wake Island and his later military career. Few mentioned the radio he built in Cabanatuan. It was a small footnote in a life of service. But for the men who survived that prison camp, Devereux's radio was anything but a footnote. It was a lifeline. A source of hope. Proof that they hadn't been forgotten. That rescue was possible. That survival was worth fighting for.